This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on is we have discovered a little-known fact, which is that the Republican isolationists are a tiny, tiny faction of the MAGA coalition. They are completely out of touch with Donald Trump, and they are completely out of touch with MAGA voters, and we've got the numbers to prove it, because the Ronald Reagan Institute has come out with its annual poll of foreign policy attitudes, and they describe very broadly the foreign policy views of the American people, Republicans, Democrats, etc. But I dug into the numbers on MAGA, and MAGA voters are not isolationists, and neither is Donald Trump. And I will tell you that my favorite thing about the war with Iran, other than seeing B-2 bombers blowing up Fordo with repeated pummeling, is the repeated pummeling that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson and all the loathsome isolationists on the right have taken from discovering that Donald Trump is not an isolationist, and neither are his supporters.
Exactly. Listen, this is hugely important. And, I'm not going to say that Donald Trump is a neocon, because I don't think he is. But I think that Donald Trump is somebody who believes in the slogan that he articulates repeatedly, which is peace through strength. And I think that the American people are right behind him on this. And it's as you say, and I rant about this a lot in our interview with our guest today, but it's as you say, MAGA people are more like that, not less like that. And what has driven me just batty over the last few days is reading one article after another. Here, wait, let me grab a couple headlines. Trump's military attack on Iran reveals split among MAGA diehards. Are the MAGA isolationists losing influence over Trump's Iran deliberations? Ooh, let's see. Iran strikes push Vance, a foreign intervention skeptic, into the role of salesman. That was kind of funny. MAGA is divided over Trump's decision to bomb Iran. Will it last? Actually, MAGA isn't divided. Mark's coalition of isolationists in a phone booth, right? The Lindbergh caucus, they are divided with Trump, but they don't represent anything but a minuscule minority within the Republican Party.
So let me just give you a summary of the top line numbers so that people understand what we're talking about. So on Iran, 90% of self-identified MAGA Republicans said that preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon is important to U.S. security, including 74% who said doing so matters a great deal. This was a couple of weeks before the fighting broke out between Israel and Iran, so this was still theoretical and not in response to what Trump was doing. 73% majority of MAGA voters said the United States should be more engaged and take the lead on foreign policy, while just 20% said the U.S. should be less engaged and react to events. 84% of MAGA voters said the U.S. has a moral obligation to stand up for human rights and democracy whenever possible in international affairs. Just 14% of MAGA voters disagree. 71% say that they support the U.S. responding with military force if a NATO ally in Europe was attacked. Just 19% of MAGA voters disagreed. That went down to 44% if they weren't paying their dues, which I'm fine with that. 73% of MAGA Republicans said they supported, quote, taking military action to defend Taiwan if China were to attack or blockade the island. Just 18% disagreed. And by the way, all those numbers, every single one of them, MAGA Republicans were more hawkish and less isolationist than establishment Republicans. This is a Jacksonian movement that doesn't want to go out and seek war, doesn't want to do nation building, doesn't want to go and send hundreds of thousands of American troops to invade countries. But when our enemies threaten us, they want to punch him in the face. And that's exactly where Donald Trump is. And that's not where the Tucker Carlsons of the world and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world are. And they're learning the hard way where the MAGA movement really is.
Yeah, they're making a lot of dumb-ass statements. And Tucker really embarrassed himself absolutely insanely.
Kooky Tucker Carlson, as Donald Trump referred to him.
That's Donald Trump being nice, because he's not kooky. He's a really, really bad person. And I'm sorry that he's become that person. But I think this is, I know you've been trying to make an effort here. I'm certainly not a MAGA type, so I'm perfectly happy to not be influential on this. But I think that it is on you and people like you who are supporters of the president to make clear, not just to him, but to the world, that actually these people who we are constantly getting saddled with, we're constantly getting blamed for their anti-Semitism. We're constantly getting blamed for their isolationism. And actually, they just speak for themselves.
Yeah. It's not really a matter of persuading Donald Trump because, look, this is the guy who took the gloves off and destroyed the ISIS caliphate. This is the guy who bombed Syria twice for using chemical weapons against its people. So no specific national interest there. He was just disgusted seeing pictures of what the Assad regime did to innocent men, women, and children, and he decided to take out their chemical abilities. This is a guy who launched a cyber attack on Russia and the St. Petersburg troll farm that was interfering with our elections. This is the guy who, when the Obama-Biden administration refused to give lethal aid to Ukraine after they took Crimea, he was the first one to send them Javelin missiles. This is the guy who took out Qasem Soleimani and then told the Iranians that if you retaliate and kill a single American, I'm going to kill the Ayatollah Khamenei. This is not an isolationist. And so I really was not terribly worried that Trump would not do the right thing in Israel. I was not surprised by what he did with Iran, but I think some people in the MAGA right, the isolationist right, I shouldn't say the MAGA right because they're really not MAGA. They have tried to hijack MAGA for their Fortress America ideology, and they're finding that MAGA is not with them. And they were surprised. I wasn't surprised, but I'm glad that they found out the hard way that they are, as I like to put it there, they would have to meet in a phone booth if we still had phone booths.
I loved that line. And on that line, which by the way, you managed to use in our last week's podcast as well.
Well, a good line should be repeated.
Yes, let's make it a thing.
I think we'll do it in every podcast.
I know. Well, all right. Actually, you know what? I agree. That is a sentiment worth emphasizing. Let's talk a little bit about our guest. We've had him on the podcast several times already. Roger Zakheim is the Washington director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Before he joined the Reagan Foundation, he was general counsel and deputy staff director of the U.S. House Armed Services Committee, where he managed the passage of the annual National Defense Authorization Act.
Here's our interview. All right. Well, Roger, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we love having you on, and you do this great poll every year, which continues to tell the world the story that the Republican Party, and not just the Republican Party, but the MAGA Republican Party, is not isolationist, nor are the American people. So give us the top lines. Tell us what the most interesting findings were, and then we can go into a discussion of these specifics.
Well, I suffered the indignity, or perhaps a compliment, that people refer to it now as the Thiessen poll. So I had to explain to them. It's the Reagan Institute that puts out the poll, but we are very grateful for those who cover it, including one Mark Thiessen. The headline here, and we've talked about this when I had the opportunity to join you in the past, is that, yes, Americans are not isolationists. They absolutely want America leading in the world. What I think is the most fascinating takeaway, in addition to where you focus, Mark, which is the mindset of MAGA Republicans, is that overall, Americans want to be more engaged than they did last year and the year before. In other words, we're in a moment, and I think this is worthy of discussion, where Americans are like, I want the U.S. to lead now, and I feel more strongly about that today than I did prior to January 2025. It's the highest numbers we've seen, 64% overall want the U.S. to be more engaged and lead, than the entire time we've asked this question, which goes back to 2021. And so to me, and I tend to reduce things to leadership, it's the sort of leadership that President Trump is offering that is motivating people that had been on the sidelines in terms of what America should be doing in the world. And of course, that refers to Republicans, and in particular, as you've pointed out, Mark, MAGA Republicans.
So I want to talk about a whole bunch of political conclusions and weirdnesses that I derive from this poll. But first, Roger, just for our listeners' context, why don't you give us some of your, in addition to that rejection of isolationism, why don't you give us a little bit of a deep dive into the numbers that you guys are finding? Because I think that'll help orientate all of our listeners to the conversation we're having.
What I was just referencing in terms of wanting to lead in the world, it was 64% overall. That's up from 54% a year ago. If you go back to February 21, it was 51%. I'll tell you another one that really we focus on here at the Reagan Institute. It obviously is a big part of President Reagan's legacy that we think matters to America, has mattered in the past, and should matter in our future, which is, what foreign policy principles should we be promoting? And strong U.S. military, kind of essential for peace and prosperity, is a question we ask. Overall there, it's, this number, I'm just pulling it up here, 85% in June, right? And so that's overall, but that's consistently been 86%, 85% if you go back to June 2023. Not surprisingly, 93% of Republicans want to have peace, sort of strong military is essential for peace and prosperity. But Democrats are at 80%. I'll give you another one that perhaps is less intuitive given the moment we're in. And Danny, here I'm referring to what President Trump said in Riyadh, which he said, okay, our interests are stability, prosperity, and peace. No mention of freedom, no mention of democracy. Well, actually, Americans support standing up for human rights and democracy, including 81% of Republicans polled. So a values-driven foreign policy is also something that we see in this survey Americans care deeply about.
Tell us what the MAGA numbers are on that, because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, right now in front of me, I have 81% on the Republican side. I think the MAGA numbers outperformed Republicans there. I think it was probably approaching 85%.
So what I find fascinating about this, and we'll stay broad, but I want to get into the MAGA discussion, is that MAGA Republicans are more internationalist than the American people in general, and they're more internationalist and more hawkish and less isolationist than establishment Republicans, which is so counterintuitive because everyone, if you listen to the isolationist right, the neocon warmongers from the Republican establishment want to drag us into foreign wars and want to do all this stuff abroad. And the isolationist MAGA movement, or restrictionist, I guess they call themselves now because they don't like the term isolationist, is pushing, the majority is pushing. Restrainers. Yeah, the restrainers. That's right. The restrainers are pushing back. And the story is the opposite in terms of the voters. The restrainers are a tiny, tiny minority, and the MAGA people are ready to go and kick some ass.
A couple of points there. One, I completely agree with this distinction. The restrainers are the minority. They have an outsized voice. We've talked about this before. They make a lot of noise. They get far more attention in terms of relative to what element of the party they represent. They misinterpreted the American people overall. They believe that, hey, Americans don't want to be engaged in the world. What actually I think has been happening, and our survey shows this, is that really Americans weren't excited about the policy of President Biden. For 4 years, they were unhappy with President Biden's policy. As a result, they don't want America to lead with that policy. But it doesn't mean that Americans don't want to be engaged in the world. And so when there is a president comes in with a policy they support, especially MAGA voters, right, they want to be engaged in the world. They don't want that limited to the, within the borders of our country or sort of withdraw from the world stage. Not at all, which goes to your point. But, it is interesting. And this is a sort of a dynamic, maybe it plays to Danny's skepticism here a little bit, which is Republican voters and particularly MAGA voters swing in terms of the level of engagement and the sort of things they want the U.S. to do in the world. They would not be supportive of a Joe Biden foreign policy. And as a result, they may adopt an isolationist outlook with that sort of leadership. Absolutely. Let's go out and lead.
So this is fascinating. And I actually want to dive into the issues as well, because I think that is even more interesting, because everybody can be for leadership when leadership involves motherhood and apple pie. But when you get down to it, it's like, oh, are you willing to support Taiwan? Are you willing to support Israel? So let's dive into that. But I want to pull you to one point, because it goes to what I think Mark and I talk about so frequently, which is that the self-appointed spokespeople, not simply of MAGA Republicans, but of the Democratic Party, do not represent their base. So I'm looking at this support for foreign policy principles in your poll. A strong U.S. military is essential to peace and prosperity. 85% of Americans believe that, 80% of Democrats, and 93% of Republicans. Two more. Promoting trade and boosting the economy, right? 85% of Americans, 86% of Democrats, 88% of Republicans stand up for human rights and democracy. To the point you just made, 83% overall, 87% of Democrats, 81% of democracy. This is what we call a super majority of Americans that support the principles that we, you, me, and Mark hold dear. I just ask myself, where the hell did Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and AOC and Bernie Sanders come from? These people don't represent the base voters of the Republican or the Democratic Party.
It's wonderful to see these numbers, truly, for those who think that the American project, particularly since World War II, has benefited from leading in the world and leading with our values. It's dissatisfaction with elected officials that I think has given these people the license to say these things. But it is clearly in these numbers something that the Democratic Party in particular on the trade piece is just fascinating that they're so far removed from where Democratic voters are. We had our economic forum, as a 30-second, shameless self-promotion here, but the Reagan Institute Foundation put on our economic forum. We had a panel that was kind of the moral case for economic growth. And it was just like, wow, where did we get to this point where that became a debatable proposition? They had to make a moral case for economic growth. Well, the reality is that you look at where the progressive left is talking, and you look at where someone on the right are talking too. Orrin Cass is somebody who's really leading this charge that came from the NatCons saying, hey, we got to reconsider this notion that big government's a problem and that we shouldn't have government solving problems for us. Well, you look at the data, they have not delivered in terms of the American people sharing that point of view.
So before Mark jumps in, I just want to make a completely extraneous comment, which is you just referred to NatCons. And I don't know whether you've heard Mark say that people like us need to be referred to as Roncons.
Oh, I'm aware of that. Mark and I had a lunch where he came up with the alternative, and I want to push that out in a more serious way. More on that in the future, perhaps a different podcast.
Yeah, there you go. Anyway, back to you, Mark.
Well, Roncons and Doncons, because the Doncons are looking pretty good right now, too. And they don't have a lot to do with the NatCons.
Key point.
Let's talk through some of the specifics here. So let's start with Israel and with the nuclear weapon. So we had all this talk in Washington because some of these the vocal isolationist minority started pushing this idea that Donald Trump was being dragged to a new Middle Eastern war by the neocons, and that the MAGA base didn't want him to take on Iran and get involved militarily in Iran. He ran against Middle Eastern wars and all the rest of it. And everyone was talking about there's a schism in MAGA. The Trump coalition is divided. And then your poll comes out and it finds... What does it find?
Well, one, in terms of the security of Israel, overall support for that, it's 71% across the board. And then we asked this question, and should have noted this at the outset, that we conducted this survey, came out of the field on June 2nd. So, you have about more than a week before Israel began its strike on the Iranian nuclear program. So all these respondents are coming in before they knew a strike would actually occur. Fortunately, we asked, would you support an Israeli strike on the Iranian nuclear program? And we saw the highest numbers came from Republicans, right? And it was approaching almost 60%. I think it was 59% is the number that comes to mind. So you saw overwhelming support on the Republican side and a majority overall who supported Israel carrying out a strike on Iran. Now, we didn't ask the question that was a question President Trump had to deal with, which was, okay, should the United States get in on the strikes? But we did ask, kind of giving them a variety of issues, what were they most concerned about, including preventing Iran from a nuclear weapons program. And that was just a shocking number to me. 84% of respondents said they were most concerned about Iran's nuclear weapon program, outperforming in terms of what Americans were concerned about Russia and Ukraine or China and Taiwan. And MAGA Republicans, Mark, and you put this in your column, outperformed 84%. And they were knocking on 90% in this survey.
90% and 74% felt very strongly accredited that it was very important. 81% want to continue to support Israel's campaign against Hamas and Hezbollah. 64% supported Israeli airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. 86% of MAGA Republicans said security of Israel was important to the United States. So what it means is there's no schism. I mean, 90% is as close to unanimity as you could possibly get. And I would venture to say after Donald Trump did it, the other 10% probably came around.
I mean, listen, let's be honest. 90% is sort of the numbers Kim Jong-il gets, right?
Yes.
This
North
is
Korean election.
So it's shocking. We had a chance to chat with Mark Levin on this, who, in my judgment, he's been heroic in terms of taking on the anti-Israel isolationists that come up from the right, and he couldn't get over it. He's 89%. It's like nothing. There's no question out there. You get 89% or even 84% of all Americans to agree upon. What else could you point to in our national conversation where 84% of Americans agree?
So, Roger, one thing that I didn't get, and it's probably because I didn't dive into the tabs on this survey, is that something we've talked about, Mark and I talked about, and we've had folks actually on talking about polls of American young people, is that these numbers are not consistent when you go into Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Is that what you see as well in your polling numbers? In other words, are the 80, 90% numbers consistent also across age groups?
No, you're correct, Danny. So the 18 to 30 demographic, I'm giving you kind of a broad stroke
Sure.
here. There's a lot of questions to survey, and some, there are exceptions. But overall, the 18 to 30 demographic is sort of the drag and the sort of numbers we're discussing.
I was going to talk about that in my column because I asked you actually to break down some of the age numbers. And what we found, though, was that there were so few of them polled that it really was. I mean, I think the swing of the poll was something like a failure rate of like 8 or 9% when you came to that because there were so few people in that younger demographic.
Yeah, we polled 1,257 adults, and they applied sort of weights to make sure we had a good feel for the different demographics. Beyond that, I can't, I didn't do well in statistics, so I can't tell you kind of whether or not that captures the 18 to 30 demographic accurately or if it was sort of under-surveyed. But I think it's a fair statement, Danny, that is a demographic we need to be concerned about if the sort of outcomes here are ones that we feel are right and we ought to support. And that's sort of a drag overall, and it's certainly not limited to Democrats, although I think that's where that population, if they had to choose a side, would land for the most part.
So let's talk about some of the other issues, like protectionism and tariffs. So Donald Trump obviously says tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, that he loves tariffs. He's going to replace the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, with the External Revenue Service. We're going to make so much money off of tariffs, you won't believe it. And it's interesting because MAGA voters believe that tariffs should be a tool of foreign policy. They support that, 86%. And they support all his specific tariffs on all specific countries, on Canada, on Mexico, on Japan, on EU, and all the rest of it. But they're not protectionist, which is interesting. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, we asked the question of, do you favor a kind of tariffs towards a more, free market approach, with sort of like a short-term tariff in order to, I interpret it as to reduce barriers ultimately, ratcheting up to bring things down versus sort of the protectionism. And so, yes, there's definitely support for the president's use of tariffs to promote trade and boost our economy and realize fairness. Like 85% say U.S. leadership is essential in that regard. And 66% think the U.S. should favor this sort of free market approach of leveraging tariffs. So that's a real boon to President Trump's approach. I think, colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute, that sort of is cringeworthy that anyone would sort of entertain and stomach a tariff if you thought of yourself as a free trader. So President Trump's got a lot of support there. I think where that support, what our survey shows, sort of wanes if it's an end, not a means. And when it's an end, not a means, then I think you see it tail off, with the exception of China. I think it's very important that as it relates to China, hey, if those suckers, can sort of last in perpetuity, game on, because throughout the survey we see Americans of all stripes, supportive of challenging and competing against China from a security standpoint and also economically.
Because it seems like inside the Trump administration, there are two camps on tariffs, right? There's the camp that says that tariffs, are an end in and of themselves and that we should impose them. And then there's a camp that says let's use tariffs as a tool of foreign policy to coerce other countries to do what we want them to do, whether it's opening markets and all the rest of it, or whether it's getting, in the case of Mexico, a crackdown and securing the border. And it sounds like the MAGA movement is much more in the camp of use them as a tool than it is as use them as
I think our survey shows that, sort of the Besant camp, the Secretary of Treasury.
Yes.
Unlike the strike on Iran, where it's sort of the outcome's here. We know where the president has landed and no longer have to speculate. On the tariff piece, it's definitely a TBD. We're in this 90-day period as it relates to Trump tariffs, and we don't know where the president will land.
So, am I allowed to speak now, Mark? Thank you for letting me get a word in edgewise.
Excuse me, I gave you the signal.
All I know is when I see Danny's signal, I notice right away and respond.
Roger, see, now Roger's going to be my podcast co-host next.
Save me, Roger. Anytime you want to take it over.
I am not getting in the mix here.
You could rename your podcast Dannyism, because that's what she wants it to be.
Hey, let me get a word in edgewise. So it was really interesting. And I actually am interested in what Mark thinks about this as well.
Well, let me tell you, Danny.
And here's another thing. Roger, it's really interesting. You asked a question about striking Iran, and you got an answer that, certainly for us was like, yeah, that's what we think too. And that's great. Prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. But it was interesting to me. We were talking about this yesterday on NBC, and our host asked about this and asked about the split in the MAGA movement, and aren't MAGA people going to punish President Trump? And I didn't have to say it. The Economist bureau chief, Idris Kahloun, said, I don't think that this counts. I think that for MAGA people, what they were focused on was not getting us into a long, extended war. It's one thing to smack down and kill Qasem Soleimani. It's another thing to take out the Iranian nuclear weapons program. It's a different thing entirely if this begins a war, and then the president's support among his base will disappear. Obviously, I think all of us think that that's an issue, but is your number really just about a one-off, and should we have doubts about just how deep that support is for a more sustained effort against Iran?
So the answer is, the question about the strike is absolutely just that. So it doesn't tell you more. Preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, right? That's more open-ended, and as we just discussed, it's robust across the country and certainly amongst Republicans and MAGA Republicans. It's like the Weinberger doctrine, right? And the Powell doctrine. So I don't view us at this moment any different than where we've been before, which is Americans, as they should, don't want blood and treasure being devoted for extended periods of time for something that they're uncertain will result in a win, or it's not existential. I think perhaps the only time Americans will support something that is extended is it's absolutely within national interest, kind of channeling what J.D. Vance put out today, and it's sort of existential, right? That really, in the absence of taking this action and seeing it through, America's way of life, our peace and prosperity, when we're convinced, we'll lose it. So that's sort of like the common sense answer, Danny. The survey itself doesn't go there, but I think it's sort of deliberate on our part, because we were more interested in seeing, does the Iraq syndrome, as the Wall Street Journal editorial board kind of referenced it, which I totally subscribe to, which is the mindset of Americans that we can't use force and we can't seek to win on anything because we think it will lead to an endless war. That's the Iraq syndrome. Does that syndrome prevent us from exercising strength, even in a limited fashion, to accomplish significant wins for our country? And this survey makes it clear that the Iraq syndrome no longer should be limiting our foreign policy and leading with strength.
Mark, what do you think?
I think that the Powell doctrine is a load of BS. I think the idea that if you break it, you buy it, actually, no, you can just break it. And that's perfectly fine. That's what we just did to the Iranian nuclear program. And we don't have to go in and occupy Tehran, and we don't have to set up a coalition provisional authority and have a U.S. governor general come in and run Tehran while we nation build. You can actually just break it, and we can break it over and over again. So, I think that, when Ronald Reagan came into office, it was a very similar period in the sense that we had just come out of the Vietnam War. There was not an appetite for sending a lot of American troops around the world. And so we had to figure out a way to flex American military muscle without deploying large numbers of troops into foreign wars. And he managed to do that. And I think that that's where a lot of Republicans are right now. I think there are a lot of Republicans who feel burned by the Iraq War and don't want to do that again, but they don't want to stop leading the world. Your poll shows very clearly that they think that the world is better off and America's better off when we lead. So the answer is, how do you've got the neo-isolationist, phone booth club telling us that we can't do anything because we don't want to get involved in foreign wars and we don't want regime change, which Trump very clearly said, what's wrong with regime change the other day on Truth Social? If Iran won't make Iran great again, maybe we will. But that doesn't mean that we can't do anything.
Correct.
And so we got to lead. We just got to lead in a different way than we did.
Yeah, I was referencing the Weinberger doctrine, just to nerd out here, given my sponsor, the Reagan Institute. This is the idea that if we're going to employ the military, let's do it with overwhelming force and win decisively and avoid the protracted things, which sounds obvious, but if you go back to where this was the debate at the time in 83, was sort of what our Lebanon policy would be and what ultimately became a failed peacekeeping mission, almost a precursor to what Iraq became on steroids. But it's this idea that, sort of what Walter Russell Mead talks as, sort of like this Jacksonian approach. Yeah, we can go ahead and impact world events, right? And we can use our strength to do it, to realize it, but let's do it in a sort of a comprehensive way, not in a mealy-mouthed, iterative fashion where we're not doing everything we can to win. And there's that word again, right? This idea of winning, which, again, we had lost as a country. And certainly, 4 years of President Biden, you would never hear that word as related to Ukraine or any other foreign policy matter. And that's one that I think should drive our decision-making and our policies.
And also keep in mind that what Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump have in common is they're among the two presidents in the last half century who didn't deploy large numbers of troops in foreign wars. But Ronald Reagan was also the greatest regime change president in American history. Regime change is not incompatible with peace through strength. Regime change is not incompatible with not doing nation building. So I think that we need to go back to our recent history and learn that, the Trump doctrine can be a resumption of,
freedom
in many
doctrine.
ways, of the Reagan doctrine.
One thing that was a question here that I don't know if it got your attention, but we did ask, when it's sort of this Doge was in the backdrop here, but support for funding programs and organizations designed to advance freedom and democracy abroad, getting at the National Endowment for Democracy, which of course came out of the Reagan administration and President Reagan's Westminster speech, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, all these entities that was sort of the softer way in which the U.S. advances freedom, particularly in countries where people are oppressed and they don't have freedom, denied countries. Interesting thing here is that overall there was 57% support in our survey of freedom promotion programs. And amongst Republicans, the number was 52%. Even in this environment of Doge and fair critique of USAID, there was still majority support by Republicans for freedom promotion programs like the NED.
So again, I guess there's a disconnect here for me, which is that we're seeing that Ukraine doesn't have the same amount of support as, say, preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon. But we're still up above a supermajority. We're up above 67%, right? We're above 70%, in fact, with 40% saying it matters a great deal and 33% saying it matters. The number on Russia-Ukraine is higher than the number on the security of the state of Israel,
Yes.
which is interesting. And, I get that everything depends on the moment in which questions are asked as to what people prioritize. But if we see a total consistency between what MAGA Americans think about Israel and Iran from the President of the United States, why is there this inconsistency on Ukraine? And obviously, I'm asking you a question that should go to Donald Trump, but how displeased are people by it? Do you see any hints in your survey about why they're fine with the fact that he's not doing what he did in Israel, Iran, with Ukraine, Russia? Or, I'm going to give you another off-ramp here, as people like to say, or is this a Biden hangover thing? Biden did it, therefore we hate it.
Yeah, I see it in that category, Danny. I see it Biden hangover. There's just sort of this partisan divide over Israel and partisan divide over Ukraine, with Democrats overwhelmingly supporting Ukraine and wanting to see the U.S. give material support to Ukraine, with Republican voters sort of far more enthusiastic supporting Israel and lagging on the Ukraine side. We're seeing this emerging sort of Trump doctrine, and I'm curious, as President Trump travels to the NATO summit, to what extent he actually articulates it, but it's been there in pieces, which is like the United States will support allies and partners, and they can go ahead and fend for themselves and fight for themselves, and the U.S. will support them if they do that. And obviously that just played out with respect to Israel and Iran. Now the question is, will it also apply to Ukraine and more broadly to Europe in dealing, and NATO in dealing with Russia? We're seeing that with the 5% commitment that President Trump will travel to Europe and say, hey, this was what I demanded and you've all signed up for it. And sort of an application or example of what I've just described, that Europe needs to own their neighborhood and the U.S. will back them up if and when they do. And I see, unfortunately, Ukraine may be the product of that, and it's probably not enough to help them counter Russian aggression.
But what I found really interesting about your NATO numbers was the MAGA support for basically what Trump's position is, which was we support NATO as long as they carry their weight. So if you look at the MAGA numbers, when they asked, would you support or oppose the U.S. responding with military force if a NATO ally in Europe was attacked, 71% of MAGA Republicans say yes, which is 10 points higher than establishment Republicans, only 61%. So those pesky old establishment Republicans are up for Article 5. But it drops to 44% if they have not paid their dues, whatever the dues are that the alliance sets. And also 50% of MAGA Republicans want to increase U.S. military presence in Eastern Europe to counter Russia. I think those are very robust, common sense numbers.
Well, there's what to work with there, Mark. The one sort of outcome of this survey, right, and we asked the questions, and the kind of data is what it is. Openness to withdrawing from NATO. That surprised me. We asked, would you support or oppose withdrawing the U.S. from NATO? And the total support of withdrawing was 33%, but you got over 50%. So it's a reflection of all this baggage. Dan, as you said, the Biden hangover, but also sort of the president's two-pronged approach to dealing with Russian aggression. On the one hand, hey, you got to fend for yourself. On the other hand, we're not going to let an adversary of the United States sort of have his way and undermine U.S. national security. But the walking away from NATO, which again, now, here we are the end of June with the NATO summit, we're going to see a lot of embrace and support for NATO given that the alliance has taken on this 5% of GDP commitment to national defense.
Right. No, I was surprised by those numbers as well. 33% supported withdrawing from the NATO alliance and 55% opposed it. 12% of people were like, I don't know.
Exactly.
We solidly have 12% of people who don't know on all issues. But I want to ask you a devil's advocate question. Mark and I try to do this whenever we have somebody who's talking about polling results on. Because as we know, as Americans, as people who live in a democracy, you can get any poll result you want, right? That is really true. And while I think that the Reagan Foundation is unbelievably scrupulous and uses professionals to do it, and it's not you guys who are picking up the phone and going, hey, I'm Roger Zakheim. What do you think about it? Help us understand a little bit about the kind of questions that you asked in order to get these numbers. Would you share with us a couple, especially on some of the blockbuster, hey, this is what MAGA people think, and actually they're more Nikki Haley than Nikki Haley questions?
Yeah, so one, as you reference, we engage with professional pollsters to put this together. And we try to ask questions in the same way year over year. So we get the trend analysis. And we've done it across administrations, and the events have changed dramatically as well. So it's sort of at this point, because we're committed to the formulations, Danny, it's very hard for us to sort of drive certain outcomes. Now, in this particular survey, we didn't ask about national defense, but it's sort of indicative, right? We asked, do you support more funding for national defense? And then we'd say, okay, how does that rack and stack against other spending priorities? And we always get an answer of like, hey, we want more defense spending. And then when we ask the respondents to, sort of rack and stack them, well, we also want our health care and we also want education funding. And so you see where defense sort of plays within that. If you were just trying to drive an outcome that the Reagan Institute would want, you wouldn't ask sort of the racking and stacking part of the question. And that plays out, for example, on the Iran question, where we asked those surveyed to share what were they most concerned about, what matters to them. And we had a variety of things there. In addition to asking about preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, we put in there tariffs to promote trade deals and also illegal immigration across the southern border of the United States. Right now, if I wanted to drive the Iran question, for example, I would not put in the immigration one if I thought, hey, MAGA was going to jump to immigration and away from Iran. We put it in because, that these are sort of what voters are thinking about. And it shocked me that concern about immigration was 74%, lower than it was a year earlier, which was at 80%, and underperforming relative to Americans concerned about Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, right? So that's an example of one where we mixed it up and could have had a result that perhaps wasn't the one that, as an entity seeking to advance American leadership in the world, might have wanted.
And that's also partly because Donald Trump solved the border in 2 weeks.
Well, yes, I mean, if you get to the why, which is pretty cool, right? The border crisis.
You solve a problem.
It's no longer a crisis, and it should be.
You asked about people's concern about the Iranian nuclear program right now. It might be lower than it was a couple of weeks ago when you did the poll because you destroyed it or set it back a hell of a lot.
Point taken.
Let's talk a little bit about China and Taiwan because I thought those numbers were really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And this is one of those issues where the divide between MAGA and non-MAGA Republicans is really surprising. The MAGA Republicans, on every question you ask, supermajorities are concerned about human rights violations, the Chinese holding national debt, China developing artificial intelligence, overtaking the U.S. as the world's #1 superpower, etc. But you ask the question, if China were to attack or blockade Taiwan, would you support or oppose the U.S. military taking actions to defend the islands? That's about as pointed a question as you can ask. Do you want to commit the U.S. military to go to war with China over Taiwan? 73% of MAGA Republicans said that absolutely they did. Only 62% of non-MAGA Republicans said that. So MAGA really doesn't like China and is willing to commit U.S. forces to a war with Beijing to defend Taiwan.
Yeah, it shows sort of the Jacksonian impulse, to borrow from Mead again, right? This idea that MAGA is, hey, if we're dealing with an adversary and they're messing with our interests, we're ready to go. And other Republicans that perhaps take the sort of more establishment, pure almost, hey, let's look for other means of solving that problem or just not solving it. The Taiwan piece, as you point out, Mark, is really interesting because it's not victim of the partisanship.
Mm-hmm.
So you were just kind of parsing how Republicans play out. There's still a majority of Republicans, and just MAGA's even stronger than non-MAGA Republicans. But this is a major foreign policy and national security issue that remains a bipartisan, agreed-upon problem, that the United States has a competition, an adversary in China, and they're concerned about it, and they're prepared to support military action against it. So the numbers came out, 70% overall, 75% Democrats, 70% Republicans. When you give them a little more detail about what's at stake, those numbers really go up overall. It's the undecided undecideds. It's that really kind of weigh down this number, but still 70%. So Taiwan, for the most part, should look at this survey and feel like, yeah, they get the backing of a bipartisan supermajority of Americans. But, we did ask, we want to hit on this, but we've sort of gotten into some details about what Americans are concerned about. And we were just talking about how sort of news and events drive the mindset of respondents. And that's also true here. Increasingly, Americans are concerned about China in this country, from balloons to technology. It's not just the geopolitical actions and Chinese PRC aggression against Taiwan, but it's actually what the PRC is doing here, from technology theft and the like, that's weighing on the minds of Americans.
The other thing that I found, there's so many things I found interesting about your polling results, but that far from supporting isolationism, MAGA Republicans in particular, and Republicans are sort of imperialist. There's strong support for manifest destiny in the 21st century. Talk about your findings on Greenland and the Panama Canal.
Well, they're not surprisingly, the president's push on Greenland and the Panama Canal is something that MAGA Republicans, and there's a strong partisan divide of this, but MAGA Republicans, stand firmly behind. And whether that's driven by sort of a sophisticated sense of national security in the Arctic to the concern about China sort of interfering with this U.S. economic and trade interests of the Panama Canal, the president's voters and his strongest supporters in the party stand squarely behind him on those issues.
They even want Gaza.
God help them.
A majority want Gaza.
I mean, the question we asked, to put it to this is, Danny, this goes to your point about question. Do you support or oppose pursuing the following proposals for U.S. territorial expansion, which have been discussed recently? And as it relates to Greenland, it got 47% total. Panama Canal got 55% of people who strongly support or somewhat support. Gaza, this won't surprise you, shows there's some common sense here, 33%.
I can't believe it's 33%.
54% of MAGA voters say yes.
Well, and Mark just explained how they got to 33%, but there we go. One more question, which gets to a point we started with, and it's that word winning, which everybody loves a winner, and Americans love to win. We asked, which country is winning the 21st century so far? And 44% said the United States, 27% said Russia. And there you go. So it says a lot.
Remarkable. And something, the reason we love talking to you every single time you guys do this survey is because the conventional wisdom is wrong. The mainstream media is wrong. The self-appointed spokespeople of the Democratic and Republican parties are wrong. In fact, the American people are much as we have described them always, which is generous, compassionate, courageous, unwilling to go seeking adventure in search of monsters, but willing very much to confront those monsters when they see them and understand them. This is why I love this country, and anytime that I feel depressed about where everybody is, I think I need to look at the work the Reagan Foundation is doing, because they're going to remind me that Americans are the greatest people on earth.
Amen.
Amen, Danny. We're going to make
For
America
once.
great again.
Mark, we're making the podcast great again. Mark and Danny finally agree.
Thank you, guys. Great to be with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Roger. So, Danny, what do you think?
So I guess I brought up this inconsistency, which is that the American people are really tough, and Republicans and MAGA Republicans are really tough on Iran. They're really tough on Taiwan, really, really tough on Taiwan. And when I say tough on Iran, I mean they're tough against the nuclear program, and they're tough in support of Taiwan against communist China. And they're really supportive of Ukraine, although less so. But the president is really not enthused about that. And a lot of people like to ascribe to him a love affair with Vladimir Putin, which I don't think is true. But I have a harder time explaining it. How do you think about it?
Well, this is a complicated story because he came into office really seeking to try and help Ukraine and really liking Zelensky. And then Zelensky came in to the Oval Office and disrespected the Oval Office and him. And it really set Ukraine back a lot. And Ukraine has spent many months recovering from that. And both in terms of Ukraine's relationship with Trump, but also with MAGA voters who looked at that and said, boy, I didn't like that. I didn't like being lectured by a foreign leader in the Oval Office that way. So I think Zelensky set his cause back. I think they've righted the ship for the most part, in the sense that what Trump would tell you privately, and I know what he's told Zelensky privately, is I'm trying to save your country. And that's what he's trying to do. And he feels that in order to do that effectively, he needs to be a neutral arbiter and try and not publicly be backing Ukraine, but trying to get Putin to agree to peace. You know, since we're talking about the Reagan Institute poll, there's an analogy here, which is that there were a lot of people, including a lot of conservatives, who were really unhappy with Ronald Reagan's constant meetings and praise for Mikhail Gorbachev. They didn't like him negotiating. I think Howard Phillips famously said that Ronald Reagan was a useful idiot of Soviet communism. The Reagan presidency ended, and the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union fell, and Eastern Europe became free, and the wisdom of his approach became apparent. Ronald Reagan was right to try and negotiate with our adversaries and try and stabilize things and achieve peace. The difference is that he had Mikhail Gorbachev, Trump has Putin. He has the Ayatollah. These are not partners. In order to be able to do peace and negotiate, you have to have a willing partner. And I think he believes in his powers of persuasion. I believe even now he thinks that he can get the Ayatollah and the Iranian regime to now peacefully agree to an end to their nuclear program. And I like that confidence. I appreciate it. But I think he's going to discover that it took 3 Soviet premiers who died before Gorbachev came around
And drop off.
And drop off. All had to die before he got a leader he could work with. I don't know if there's how many down the pipeline it is in Russia before Putin and some of his successors die and give Trump somebody he can work with. But it's probably not going to happen in the next 4 years. And so I think he's going to have to come to the conclusion, which I think he needs to test it, that Putin really isn't interested in peace. And I think he will come to that realization. And what he's said to me and what he has said publicly is that if Putin doesn't agree to peace and Ukraine does, he's going to sanction the hell out of it, put secondary sanctions on their oil, and he's going to arm Ukraine. And so one of the things I like about Donald Trump is he does what he says. And so I'm going to expect that he'll do what he says in Ukraine down the line.
I hope you're right. And I love this poll, and Roger's a great guest. Folks, I'd love to know what you think. Don't hesitate to share with us your views about whether the poll's results are correct, and we will see you next week.
Take care. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.